The Phantom of the Opera, Paris, France, September 1896. It was a late summer evening, and the people were starting to come to the opera house. The Palais Garnier was one of Paris's newer opera houses, opulent and beautiful. It entertained many of the higher classes of France, and tonight they're all coming to see the ballet being performed. But deep beneath the opera house lay a dark secret. In one of the sewers nearby the opera house, a local rat catcher was walking with a lantern in one hand and the other hand holding what was draped over his shoulder, a sack. That sack was used to capture the rodents. As he was walking by, he heard footsteps. The rat catcher quickly went to hide. As he was hiding, he could see the shadow of a caped figure walking by, and that figure went up the steps. After the figure was gone, the rat catcher emerged from hiding and went about his business quickly. Meanwhile, back above the Paris Opera House, everyone was starting to take their seats before the ballet starts. While that was going on, in one of the offices of the Opera House, there was a group of men that were discussing business. The business? Well, the old managers of the Opera House were selling the Opera House to the new owners. The new owners of the Paris Opera House were going to be Monsieur Montcarmin and Monsieur Debienne. Both men were buying the opera house from retiring manager Monsieur Ricard. After the new manager signed the paperwork, Monsieur Ricard says to the new managers, "Well, gentlemen, congratulations and Godspeed on your endeavors. And I must warn you, too, now that you own this opera house comes with a ghost." And the two new managers looked at each other and they said to Monsieur Ricard, "Oh, come on, Monsieur Ricard. We're not children. We don't believe in ghosts." And Monsieur Ricard says to them, "Well, I don't expect you to believe or not. I'm just warning you so you don't come at me later saying I didn't tell you about a ghost." And the two new managers acknowledged, and then Monsieur Debienne asks Monsieur Ricard, "So what did you do about the supposed ghost?" And the old manager says, "Well, I did nothing because he always paid for box 5. That's where he tends to haunt." And then the old manager says, "Well, gentlemen, if you excuse me, I have to get home to my wife." And the old manager leaves the office. As he left, the new owners of the opera decided to go investigate box 5. And as they were coming up to box 5, they spotted one of the maids who works in the opera, and they asked the maid, "Madame, we need to ask you something." The maid recognized the two men as the new owners of the opera house, and she greeted them, and they greeted her back. And then they asked her the big question, "Is box 5 purchased tonight?" And the woman says to the two new owners, "No, messieurs, no one purchased box 5 tonight, but there is someone in there. I don't know if you believe in superstition, messieurs, but it is the opera ghost." And then she says to the new owners, "I don't bother him, but after the show, I go into the box and collect the money he leaves behind. He pays for a seat, and he pays in gold." And then the two new owners look at each other, and Montcarmin says, "Well, it doesn't sound to me like a ghost. It just sounds to me like somebody who's trying to get out of paying full price for those box seats." So the two new owners go into box 5, and they look through the peephole of the door, and they see a dark figure sitting there watching the ballet. The two owners looked at each other, then they go back outside to the hall, and then they debate whether they should just kick out the man now or wait after the show. But they decided to not wait after the show and do it now. As they go back into box 5 and they open the door, suddenly, to their shock, the figure that was sitting there was gone. They look around and they couldn't find him. There was no way that this figure could have left without them seeing him, because there was only one entrance and exit into the box, and that all led out to the hallway. But they wondered how he snuck out. And then Debian sees on the empty chair a gold coin. He picks it up, and Moncarmen says to Debian, well, at least he paid for his seat. Meanwhile, backstage in the massive Paris Opera House, one of the stagehands by the name of Jean was working on securing some props. As he was doing that, he heard strange noises like wood creaking and faint footsteps. Gene knew all too well who it was, and he was looking around to see if he saw him. He never saw the Phantom, but he's heard him plenty of times, and he knew other workers who have seen the Phantom. As he looked around, he saw nothing, but he did hear more footsteps like they were nearby. He turned to look behind him, nothing. Then he turned to look to the right, nothing. And he was starting to get scared, and he decided to walk off quickly to where the other men were working at. And there he encountered another stagehand by the name of Joseph Bouquet. Joseph Bouquet has worked for the Paris Opera House since it opened, and he knew all too well about the Phantom also. He has seen him plenty of times. And Jean asked, Joseph, I think he's here. And Joseph calms Jean down, and he says to Jean, it's okay, Jean. He's here, all right. I heard him earlier in the third cellar where all the scenes are stored. And Joseph goes on to tell Jean, and last night he stole some food from the restaurant, a jar of pickled pig's feet, some cheese, and I think a box of crackers. And Jean says to Joseph, Sacred Bleard, why does a ghost need to eat? And Joseph says, who knows? And then he continues to work. Jean, uneasy, goes back to where he heard the Phantom, but everything was quiet now. Well, it was late night, the opera was closed, and Joseph was working late, getting some things secured before he would go home. As he was doing that, he had finished pushing a giant statue to one corner. Afterwards, he reaches in for his pocket and pulls out a bottle of Cointreau, where he proceeds to open it and take a sip. Afterwards, he closes it up, and all of a sudden, right in front of him, dropping from the catwalks above, was the Phantom. The Phantom was wearing a black suit, and he had a long black cape on. He had a black fedora and a white porcelain mask, and covering the bottom half of his face with thick black cloth. And the Phantom says to Joseph, Monsieur, I will have some of your Cointreau. Joseph nervously hands the bottle over to the Phantom. The Phantom pulls the cloth covering his lower face, revealing his lower jaw, and to the shock of Joseph, he could see that the skin of the Phantom was yellow like leprous parchment, and his lips were also yellow. And then the Phantom takes a swig of the Cointreau, and then he says to Joseph, My God, monsieur, this is a very terrible drink. I don't know how I could drink this garbage. Then he chucks the bottle behind him, and he says to Joseph, Well, Monsieur Bouquet, I'm here because you know too much. And Joseph says, No, please spare my life. I always kept quiet about you. And then the Phantom says to Joseph, Oh, no, you haven't. You talk all the time about me, and now you discovered one of my secrets. And I know you, Joseph, you're not going to keep it a secret. You'll tell somebody eventually. But now I'm here to put a stop to it. And despite being cornered by the Phantom, Joseph quickly darted to the left, running from the Phantom. The Phantom quickly covered his lower face with the cloth and decided to give chase to Joseph. Joseph eventually made it back to the upper floor. He was now backstage when all of a sudden a sandbag falls from the catwalk, hits him over the head, and knocks him out cold. And then the Phantom lands right next to him after leaping off the catwalk. And the Phantom says to the unconscious Joseph, Well, Monsieur Bouquet, I'm not going to kill you yet. I need you for a purpose. And then he proceeds to grab Joseph by his legs and drags him off. The next day, in a garden near the opera house, a young woman who was slender, with blonde hair and blue eyes, was walking by, looking at all the flowers, and starting to see that some of the leaves were starting to change on the trees as the season was transitioning from summer to autumn. Well, she wasn't alone. She was joined by a rather handsome man who was tall. He had his brown hair slicked back, and he had a pencil thin mustache. His name was the Viscount Raoul de Chagny. He was the vice count to some little county out in northern France. His older brother, Philippe de Chagny, was the reigning count up there. He is 22 years old and he's in love with Christine Day. And Christine Day was also 22 years old, but her feelings were divided between him and her music career that she'd been working so hard at since she was a young teenager. Raoul comes up to her and grabs her and begins to passionately kiss her, and she shoves him back, saying, "Raoul, we are in public. You must control yourself." And Raoul says back to her, "The only way I'm going to control myself is if you allow me to be your husband." And then Christine says to Raoul, "We've been through this plenty of times. I'm not going to talk about it here." And then she asks Raoul, "What time is it?" Raoul pulls out his pocket watch and he says, "It's 1:45. And Christine says, "Oh my goodness, I gotta head to the opera house. We have a dress rehearsal for tonight's show." And then she asks Raoul, "Are you going to be there tonight?" And Raoul says, "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Christine." And then she kisses Raoul and walks off hurriedly. Raoul says to himself out loud, "Oh Lord, why do you resist me, Christine? Why?" Later, at the manager's office of the opera house, the mother of the opera's prima donna, Carlotta Rioli, was there. Her mother's name was Bianca Rioli, and she was a slender, red-headed woman with a very bad temper, and she was chewing out the new managers of the opera house. She was demanding a pay raise for her daughter, and she was also demanded an inquiry for the recent threats that are being made to her daughter as of late by the so-called opera ghost. And the men were very uneasy, and one of the managers, Montcarmen, says to Bianca Rioli, "Mademoiselle Rioli, rest assured, we will find out who's making these threats to your daughter." And Bianca Rioli says, "Well, I hope you do, because if you don't, then rest assured, I have friends who are very interested in buying this opera house." Then Bianca Rioli storms out of the office, and then Debian says to Montcarmen, "Oh my goodness, Maurice, why? Why didn't Ricard not warn us about this woman?" And then Montcarmen says, "Well, Christophe, I think he was just trying not to scare us away. He really wanted to sell this company." And the men decided to go down to a local cafe and soothe their nerve with some coffee. Meanwhile, in the dressing room of Christine Day, she was getting herself ready for the performance tonight, when all of a sudden she heard a muffled voice coming from within the walls of her dressing room.
My dear, do you hear me?"
Christine responds, "Yes, I hear you. Are you—" Before she could say the word, the voice says,
"Yes, I am. I am the angel of music sent by your father to help you. Now we must get ready for tonight's performance. Now sing the part."
Christine was about to sing aloud the part of Cybele before the voice interrupted her, saying,
No. You're not going to sing the part of Cybele tonight. Tonight, you're doing the part of Marguerite.
And Christine says, "No, that's the part of Carlotta." And the voice says to her,
No. Tonight, you will do the role. I will see to it. You forget I am the angel of music, and I can make many things happen.
And without a further thought, Christine began singing the part of Marguerite aloud. Later that night, it was the premiere night for the big operatic event of the Opera House, Faust, and it looked like to be a full house tonight. As the people were arriving, one carriage pulls up in front of the Opera House, and out steps out Anatole Garonne, the premier opera critic for the Parisian newspapers, and everybody was greeting him. As soon as he came inside, he was escorted to his reserved seat in the upper tiers, next to where the two managers of the opera were going to sit at. While all that was going on, in the dressing room of the prima donna, Carlotta Rioli, she was in the bathtub taking a bath before the performance. Her mother was there telling her about the deal she has been working with the new managers, and then Carlotta says to her mother, "Mother, I need you to do me another favor." And then Bianca says, "What is it, my dear?" And then Carlotta says, "Have Christine moved back to the chorus. I don't trust her and I don't like her." And Bianca says to Carlotta, "Why, she's not a threat. She was barely lucky to become your understudy." And then Carlotta says to Bianca, "I suspect it's her friends, maybe that lover of hers, the Vicomte, that's been sending me all those threats." And then Bianca says, "Never mind that, Carlotta. The new managers are looking into that." Then there was a knock on the door, and Carlotta screams, "Come in." It was the maid bringing in more flowers into the dressing room. Afterwards, Carlotta dismisses her mother since she had to get dressed for the performance. After her mother leaves, she gets out of the bathtub. Carlotta was 22 years old, slender, with jet black hair and brown eyes. She had dried herself off and was heading towards the back of the dressing room to look at the costume she was wearing for tonight's performance. As she was making her way back to the back of the dressing room, she almost slipped and fell on a part of the tile that was wet. After she stopped herself from falling, she looked onto the ground to see what she stepped on that was wet, and to her shock, it was blood. And she wondered where that blood was coming from. And she looked at the closet, and she can see that the closet was the origin of the blood on the floor. So she cautiously opens the closet door, and as she did that, she sees a body hanging in the closet. The body had no skin, and suddenly the head of the body lifts its head up, opens his eyes, and reaches out for her, saying, Help me!" Carlotta let out a huge blood-curdling scream and quickly fled the dressing room. Not too long afterwards, at the main auditorium, the people were taking their seats and the orchestra was practicing with their instruments as the show was about to start. Well, the two managers were in their seats, and the opera critic was in the seat next door to the managers. Debian decided to scan the whole auditorium to see how many people were in their seats. Then he looked at Box 5. Of course, Box 5 was dark. There was no one sitting there. But as he looked there, he thought he saw glowing yellow lights, like the eyes of something glowing in the dark. He turns to Montcarmen. He tells Montcarmen to look at Box 5. But Montcarmen only saw the dark box. And Montcarmen says to Debian, "Ugh, Box 5 is empty again." And then Debian says, "Oh no, Maurice, I saw something there. It looked like glowing yellow eyes." And then Montcarmen said, "Oh no, Christophe, don't start. You're starting to sound like all the employees here." Then one of the attendants comes up to the seats of the two managers, and he says to them with a kind of loud whisper, "Messieurs, there is a disaster going on. Something happened with Carlotta Rioli. She cannot sing tonight. One of you need to go to the dressing room. It is another disaster." Debian pounds his fist on the arm of the chair, and he says to Montcarmen, oh God, if it's not that woman, and then it's her mother, one of those two are going to cause me to have a heart attack." And then Montcarmen says to Debian, "Okay, Christophe, it's okay, calm down. I'll go see what's going on. Just stay here, I'll take care of everything." Well, Montcarmen gets up and quickly leaves his seat. As he heads towards the dressing room, he sees there was police there, and one detective sees that he was coming towards the dressing room and stops him. And the detective asks him, "Who are you, monsieur?" And then the man says to the detective, "I am Maurice Moncharmin. I am half owner of this opera house." And the detective identified himself. "Oh, I am Inspector Pierre Ledoux with the police, and I'm glad you're here because you have a murderer here." Moncharmin was shocked. He thought it was Carlotta, but the inspector told him that Carlotta was downstairs being questioned. And then Moncharmin asked the inspector, "Then who is the victim?" And then the inspector says to Moncharmin, "We don't know. We just know he's a man and he has no skin." And then Moncharmin was like, "Sacred blood! What kind of madman would do that?" And Inspector Ledoux says to Moncharmin, "I intend to find out." Meanwhile, in the auditorium, everyone had taken their seats, and they were waiting for the show to start. Suddenly, a man comes from behind the curtains, and he announces to the public, "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an unexpected illness that arose, the part of Marguerite will not be played by Carlotta Rioli," said the man. And some people in the audience reacted negatively, while some actually got up and left. Well, the man stepped back behind the curtains, and the show started. As the opera was going, the Phantom was sitting in box 5, watching the scene of Faust making a deal with Mephistopheles to sell his soul. As the masked Phantom was watching, he began to flash back to when he made his deal with the devil. He flashed back to a long time ago. It was a dark and stormy night, and Eric Claudan, that was the name of the Phantom before he became the Phantom, was at a brothel playing piano. Eric used to be a frequenter of brothels as he had trouble finding a woman to marry. Well, sometimes when he was waiting, he would play the piano there to entertain the guests and the prostitutes and earn extra cash. Well, the one night he was doing that, a mysterious man had come down the stairs. This man was a very handsome man with jet black hair slicked back, and he was accompanied by two of the most beautiful prostitutes in the brothel. He had come down when he heard Eric playing, and he says to Eric,
"You play very good. That is the most beautiful piano piece I ever heard. Who wrote that?"
Eric responds to the mysterious man's question, "I did." Then the man asks Eric a big question.
"I see you have a natural talent for music, and I sense that you want to be like the immortals, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven. What would you give to have that?"
And Eric answered the mysterious man, "I'd give my soul. I'd give my soul to have my music transcend time and be loved by everybody." And the mysterious man says to Eric,
"Well, my dear boy, I will grant you that. Everyone shall love you for your music, but that's all they'll love you for, your music, and not you."
And the mysterious man reaches for Eric's face and grabs Eric's face with the tips of his fingers and begins to squeeze it. Eric felt a burning sensation in his face. Eric lets out a muffled scream. "No, no, no!" Suddenly, it was over. The mysterious man was gone, and Eric's face was horribly disfigured. Then the flashback ended as Eric saw that Christine was on the stage now, about to perform the role of Marguerite. Then Christine was on the stage singing the Jewel song. While Christine was on stage performing the Jewel song, the Phantom in box 5 was shadow conducting. And sitting across in another tier was Raoul with his best friend Albert. And Raoul turns to Albert and says, "My God, man, she has the voice of an angel. I shall marry her." And then Albert says to Raoul, "Maybe after tonight you're going to lose her forever. She's going to become very famous." While the theater owners were looking on at the performance, Anatole Garonne was writing down everything. He was really enjoying the performance of Christine. He turns to look to Debienne, and Debienne nods his head in acknowledgement to Garonne. Debienne was definitely up to something. Well, the performance was over. and the auditorium erupted into thunderous applause. The Phantom was extremely happy. Christine did everything perfectly. The Phantom gets up, leaves a gold coin and a red rose on the seat, and exits box 5. Later after the show, Christine enters the restaurant with Raoul, and everybody claps and compliments Christine. Christine and Raoul take their seat and they order their dinner. And Raoul says to Christine, Christine, I fear after tonight I'm going to lose you forever. And Christine says to Raoul, no you won't. You'll never lose me. While the two were talking, a few tables away from them sat Anatole Garon and Debienne. And Debienne says to Anatole, Monsieur Garon, you owe me this favor. The public wants Carlotta Rioli. And Anatole says to Debienne, but Christine Day, she's going to be very devastated. And Debienne says to Anatole, I understand, but we do have to give the public what they want. And Anatole says to Debienne, yes, it'll take years and tears to get to the top, years and tears. And then the two men look at Christine a few tables over from them, and they see Christine was all sunshine and smiles. Little did she know what waited for her. The next morning, Raoul arrives to the boarding house where Christine was living at. He had the morning paper with him. As he knocked on the door, the owner of the boarding house let him in, and he quickly runs up to Christine's room. He knocks on the door to her room. She gets up from bed, wipes the sleep from her eyes, and opens the door. She asks Raoul if he wanted coffee. He declined, saying he had breakfast before he came. Then he shows Christine the morning paper, and he takes a seat in one of the chairs, and Christine sits across from him, and he begins to read the review of Anatole Garon. As he was reading aloud the review, he suddenly decides to stop, and he says to Christine, forget it, I think you know the rest. And Christine asks why did he stop, and Raoul says, it's nothing, it's pointless, he liked your performance. And Christine says to Raoul in a stern voice, give me the paper. And Raoul reluctantly gives Christine the paper. Christine begins to read aloud the part that Garon said about her. As she read, well, the performance was marred by the absence of Carlotta Rioli and her replacement, the understudy, Christine Day's terrible performance, as the young singer's voice was just not powerful enough for the role, and her lack of discipline showed. And then Christine threw the paper on the floor, and she began to cry. Raoul consoled her, saying to her, oh, what does that idiot Anatole know? He's a stupid old man, and someone should give him a proper caning. And then he consoles Christine some more, saying, it's okay, honey. You heard the applause last night from the audience? And then Christine says, of course they applauded. They'd be too embarrassed not to. And she began to cry some more. Raoul gets up and hugs her tight. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, in a Turkish bath, Anatole Garon was there, and he gets out of the pool, and the attendant dries him off with a towel and gives him a bathrobe. Anatole puts on the bathrobe, and the attendant asks Anatole, are you going to have your usual, monsieur? And Anatole says, no, I'm just going to head to the steam room. And then Anatole goes into the steam room. It was a big steam room, and Anatole was not alone in there. He had noticed another man was sitting in the far end of the steam room. He couldn't see the man's face because the man's face was completely covered up by a towel that was wrapped around his head. Anatole walks over to the burning hot coals, and he grabs a ladle full of water, and he asks the mysterious man in the steam room, you don't mind if I put a little more steam in here? And the man says, no, monsieur, go ahead. And Garon pours a ladle full of water on the hot coals, making more steam. And the man with the towel wrapped around his head lifts up his head and looks at Garon. Garon did not notice the man that was looking at him had sunken dark eyes. His eyeballs were yellow, and his eye color was a demonic red color. Anatole sits down, and the mysterious man asks Anatole, pardon me, monsieur, did I see you at the opera last night? And Anatole Garon says, yes, you Probably did. I am the opera critic for the newspaper. And then the mysterious man says, "Ah, so I did see you last night." And he continues to say to Anatole, "I also read your review in the paper today. Aren't you a little harsh on Christine Day?" And then Anatole says, "Oh no, I wasn't. She is very unprofessional, and I really don't want to talk about it." And the mysterious man says to Anatole, "Maybe you went to a different show because I heard something very beautiful last night." And Anatole says to the mysterious man, "Oh no, monsieur, me and you were definitely in the same show." And then the mysterious man says to Anatole, "Well then, monsieur, if I could get you better seats that befit your status, would you reconsider your opinion on Christine Day?" And Garon says to the mysterious man, "Oh no, monsieur, oh no. I'd rather die than listen to that shrieking cat sing again." And the mysterious man lets out a loud laugh. Oh, Monsieur Garon, be careful, because I could arrange that too. What the mysterious man said to Garon left him puzzled, and the mysterious man gets behind Garon and quickly pulls from underneath his robes a rope. The rope was done in a Punjabi lasso, and he quickly puts it around Garon's neck and begins to strangle him. As he was strangling Garon, he pulls the rope and drags Garon by the wall, and he violently shoves Garon's head into the wall of the steam room, smashing the wall, embedding Garon's head in it. Garon was dead, and there was a lot of blood running down the white-tiled wall from the hole where Garon's head was in. And the mysterious man, who was none other than the Phantom, leaves the steam room. Later that night, in Paris's infamous Rue Morgue, the Phantom had been wandering the area with his mask and his scarf covering the bottom half of his face. As he was walking by, there were many prostitutes soliciting him for service. One prostitute says to him, "Excuse me, monsieur, do you want to fulfill one of your desires?" And Eric says to the prostitute, "What do you know about desires, mademoiselle?" And he walks off. He had bumped into another prostitute, a young blonde-haired woman, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and then he was going to walk when he briefly paused, looked back at the blonde-haired woman, and then he outstretched his arms, offering himself to her, and she gladly accepted and wrapped her arms around his, and the two walked down the street together. Not too long later, they were in her room. She was undressing, and the Phantom was also undressing. She was about to turn on the candle when Eric blew it out. And he says to the prostitute, "There's no need to see me, mademoiselle. You're going to be paid very well, Christine." And the young prostitute says, "But monsieur, my name is Madeline." And Eric says gently to her, "No, Madeline, tonight you're Christine." And he begins to gently caress her cheeks, and the two began to kiss, and then they did their business. Well, later on, after Eric was finished, Eric was at a local pub where he was sitting in a more private area, writing down music and having a drink. He had only one friend in that pub, and it was the barmaid. She comes up to him and asks, "Well, monsieur, do you want any more beer?" And Eric says, "No, mademoiselle, I am very good." And then he pays her with a gold coin. She was very happy and walks off. As she was walking away, she had walked by a table with three unscrupulous-looking men. One of the men stops her and asks her a question. "So, who's the man sitting over there alone, writing stuff down?" And then the barmaid said, "He's a composer and he likes his privacy, so I suggest you leave him alone." And then the man asks her, "Then why does he wear a mask?" And the barmaid angrily responds back, "Well, it's none of my business, monsieur. I keep to myself." And then the man picks up a gold coin from her tray, and he sees it was gold, and he puts it back on her tray, and then she walks off, and he tells his two friends, "Boys, you hear what I'm hearing? Full pockets." Then the man gets up and walks over to the table where Eric was sitting, writing, and then he pulls out a cigar and offers it to Eric, and he asks Eric, "Care for a cigar, monsieur?" And Eric turns up to look to the man, and he says, "No, monsieur, I do not care for cigars. I do not smoke, and please do not bother me." And then Eric puts his head back down and keeps on writing some music. And the man kept pressing on, trying to find out things about Eric, and he says, "Monsieur, I've seen you here plenty of times. I would like to get to know you." And Eric says to the man sternly, "Please, monsieur, I do not care to know about you." And then Eric grabs all his paperwork and leaves. Well, as Eric was walking down the quiet streets of Rue Morgue, he knew he was being followed by that man and his two friends. They were wanting to mug him. And as soon as Eric rounds a corner, he sees the three men were there waiting for him, blocking his way. And Eric says to the three men, "Still wanting to get to know me, messieurs?" And then the lead man says, "Oh no, monsieur. Now we just want your money. Now hand it over." And the three men pull out knives. And the lead man tells the second man to his left to go after Eric. Well, that man runs at Eric with a knife, and suddenly Eric quickly disarms the man, puts the man in a headlock, and Eric unsheathes a giant dagger. And he cuts the man's head off, and then he throws the severed head at the foot of the two muggers. They scream and run off, but Eric quickly runs after them, and then he quickly draws a whip and grabs the second mugger with the whip. With the whip wrapped around his neck, the second mugger is pulled towards Eric, and Eric, with his dagger, disembowels that mugger. There was only one left, and it was the leader. He was running frantically through the narrow streets of the Rue Morgue in fright. As he was doing that, suddenly Eric, jumping from one of the higher levels, lands right in front of the mugger, frightening the man. Then Eric pulls out his change purse and rattles the change purse. And he says to the man, "This was what you're looking for, monsieur?" And then the man runs back the other way he came from. After he thought he lost Eric, suddenly Eric steps out in front of him from another street. And the man stops and he screams. And as he was running from Eric, Eric finally caught up to him and violently flung him to the wall. And the man says to Eric, "My God, you are a thing from hell." And then Eric says to the man, "And you, monsieur, are hell-bound." And Eric pulls out his dagger and slices the man's throat. Early the next morning, Madeline, the prostitute, wakes up, and she sees under her pillow 4 gold coins. She let out a big smile and grabs the coins. While at the Paris Opera House, the workers were finding out that they had a vandal last night, as many of the orchestra members were finding their instruments destroyed, violins smashed, horns bent, and drums smashed. While at the kitchen of the restaurant, the workers in the kitchen have found all the expensive china smashed and all the silverware gone. While at the owner's offices, Debian was coming in for the morning and he was sitting down at his desk. He saw a small box with a green bow tie on it and a little card, and he wondered who gave him a gift. So Debian grabs the card, pulls it out of the envelope, and opens it. He saw inside the card, written in blood, the words, "Naughty, naughty." Now his face filled with dread. He undid the green bow tie and he opened the box. And inside the box were the severed heads of rats. Debian quickly jumped out of his chair and knocked it on the ground, and he steps away from the desk. He grabs his handkerchief and puts it over his mouth to fight the urge to vomit. Suddenly, the conductor storms into his office, and he says, "Monsieur Debian, I don't know what's going on here, but we've had a vandal last night." And the conductor explains to Debian, "My music, it was all burned up. This morning, I found it all in ashes. Someone set fire to it." And then he explains that the orchestra's instruments were destroyed. Soon the kitchen staff come in and all the other staff members come in and complain to Debian about the vandalism across the opera house. In the early afternoon, Montcarmen was in the office, and Debian had filled him in already on what happened. Suddenly, Bianca Rioli storms into the office and screams at the two men, saying to them, "Messieurs, my daughter has been threatened again." And she tosses a note on the desk of Montcarmen. Montcarmen picks up the note and reads it aloud so Debian can hear it, and he reads, "Carlotta, you worthless sow, if you sing tonight, there is going to be a very bad accident." Bianca screamed at the men, and the men quickly assured her that everything was under control. Well, that night, the performance of Faust was going on again, this time with Carlotta performing the role and Christine being backstage. Luckily, the orchestra got new instruments on time, and the conductor had backup copies of the music sheets. Well, the opera was being performed, and the two owners, Montcarmen and Debian, were in their usual seats, while Raoul was in his, even though Christine was not performing tonight. As the two owners were sitting in their seats enjoying the show, one of the attendants comes up and gives Debian a note. Debian opens the note and reads it. The note read, "Carlotta, such a terrible singer, her singing may bring down something heavy." Then Debian gives the note to Montcarmen. He also read the note, and he was as confused as Debian. Meanwhile, high above the opera, in the room that contained the ropes and the counterweights that held up the 7.5-ton chandelier that illuminated the entire auditorium, was Eric with a saw, and he began to cut the ropes holding the chandelier. As Carlotta was performing, suddenly the chandelier began swaying and the lights in the auditorium were flickering. The people were looking up and they were getting scared. Then the rope snapped and the giant chandelier fell on the audience. The people who were directly underneath the chandelier were killed, and the remaining audience in the auditorium quickly fled in terror. Debian gets up from his chair and screams, "Oh no! We are ruined! Oh God! It's all finished!" Many of the performers went on stage to see what happened, including Christine. When Christine saw the horrific sight, she left. She went into her dressing room and sat in her chair. She was in shock at what happened. Suddenly, she hears the familiar voice.
Christine, Christine, it is I, the angel. I have come to take you to some place special, some place where me and you can be together and get to know each other.
Christine gets up and says, It's you! Where are you at? How are you going to take me?" And the Phantom says to Christine,
Come to the mirror. There you shall find the door, and I shall take you to a wondrous place."
Christine gets up and goes to the giant mirror in the dressing room. As she stands in front of the mirror, suddenly the mirror moves back, revealing a hidden doorway, and Christine enters the hidden door blindly. Unbeknownst to her, Raoul was on his way to see how she was doing after the accident and overheard the majority of the conversation with her and the Phantom. He quickly opens the door and sees that the secret door closes, and Raoul runs right to the mirror and tries to find a way to open that door again, but he couldn't. In anger, he pounds on the mirror and screams Christine's name. Well, Christine was in a hidden passage, and there she meets face to face her mysterious teacher, the angel of music, or so she thought. She says to the Phantom, "Monsieur, you're human." And the Phantom says to her, "Yes, I am human, but I was still sent by your father to teach you. Christine, you have a great gift for music. Your voice is that of an angel, and it is my job to teach you how to use that wondrous voice. And you did very well that night you played Marguerite." Then Christine asked the Phantom, "Then, Maestro, why do you wear a mask?" And then the Phantom says to Christine, That's a long story. I had an accident a long time ago. That's all you need to know. And then the Phantom says to Christine, "Come now, I must take you to a special place where me and you shall make music." Christine followed the Phantom, and they went through what seemed like an eternity of passages, and she could feel that they were descending. She was getting very tired, and soon she was so tired that she was ready to pass out. The Phantom had noticed, and he says to Christine, "Christine, I shall carry you the rest of the way." And then he picks up Christine, and Christine passes out. As he carried Christine the rest of the way, they have finally made it to his lair. His lair was deep underground, and there was a chamber that he had ornately decorated with velvet curtains and a reed organ, rugs, a writing desk, and a small table for eating. And there were several other ornate chairs there. He put Christine down on one of them, and then he walks over to his reed organ in the far corner, and he sits down, he puts his foot on the pedal, and he begins to play Bach's Toccata in D minor. Christine awakes and screams at the Phantom, "Where am I?" And then the Phantom stops playing and he turns to look at Christine and he says to her, "Ah, mademoiselle, welcome to my humble abode. It's not much, but it is home." And then Christine gets up and runs out the door, and then she stops. She sees a massive underground pool, and the Phantom comes up behind her and he says to her, "Ah, I see you found my underground lake." And he goes on to explain to Christine, "Feel free to run, but you'll never find your way out. You could be lost for an eternity down here in the many caverns of this place," he says to her. And then he goes on to say to her, "We're 5 cellars underground. This here is what remains of one of France's most notorious secret prisons." And he goes on to explain to her further, "For 200 years, this dungeon was used to torture and kill enemies of the monarchy and later enemies of the revolutionary government. But after Louis Philippe I's abdication, this place had fell out of use, and the prison above demolished, and this place was forgotten, and turned into one of the foundations of the Palais Garnier." Then the Phantom grabs Christine by her hand and pulls her back into his lair. And then he says to Christine, "Christine, you're very tired. Just go to this room in here and lay down and sleep." Christine did that, and she was surprised about this beautiful ornate room in here. It had a very ornate bed, and it was beautifully decorated, like it was for a woman. Well, she takes off her shoes and lays down on the ornate bed and sleeps. She slept for maybe an hour, and then she awakened again to find that the Phantom was in his writing desk writing some music down. Well, she gets up and goes by the organ to look at the organ. The organ was a typical reed organ of cherry wood. It was very beautiful, but she also noticed some sheet music on the sheet music stand. And she looked at it, and the title read Don Juan Triumphant by Eric Claudin. She grabs the sheet music from the organ and reads the lyrics, and then she hums the lyrics, and then she turns around and runs to the writing desk and asks the Phantom, "Is this yours?" And then the Phantom says, "Yes, it is. I've been trying to write my magnum opus for 11 years, and it's going at a snail's pace. But now that I found you, Christine," he says, "you're the only one that could sing it." And Christine asks him to play it for her, and the Phantom says, "No, it is not finished." And then Christine says to the Phantom, "Please, play it for me. If I'm the one to sing it, then I must hear what I'm singing," she says. And the Phantom says to her, "So be it. For you, Christine, I will do it." Then he takes the music from her hand, goes over to the reed organ, puts the music on the organ, puts his foot on the pedal, and begins playing Don Juan Triumphant. as Christine began to sing the song of Don Juan Triumphant. Her singing was captivating the Phantom. Plus, her singing, along with the organ playing, was echoing through the miles of tunnels, and the Ratcatcher heard it. Well, as Christine was singing the dark and melancholy words to a very dark and soulful song, she couldn't help how beautiful it is. The Phantom knew he had found the woman that was going to sing it. He kept on playing, she kept on singing until the song was over. The Phantom was shocked and awed, and he asked Christine, "How did he know the words to my song?" And Christine says, "I don't know. It just came to me naturally, like I've sang it before or something." And then she begs the Phantom to play more, and the Phantom says, "I cannot. It's incomplete. I've been writing this for 11 years. And then he says, with madness in his voice, 11 years. 11 years. That's a lifetime. Oh, a lifetime down these tunnels. A lifetime. A lifetime," he says. And then he says to Christine, "Christine, today you have given me the inspiration that I need to finish this. You're the only one who can sing this, and me and you shall bring the world of music to its knees with this piece." Then the Phantom pulls out from one of his pockets a jewel box, and then he opens it, and inside was a gold ring with an emerald on it. And then he pulls it out, and he quickly grabs Christine's right hand and puts the ring on her ring finger, and he says to her, "As I wedded my soul to darkness to write this piece, now your soul's wedded to the music, Christine. Me and you are now a part of this, and there's no backing away from it," he says to her. And then the Phantom tells Christine, "I am returning you to the surface, but you may never see Raoul again. You are mine, you hear? All mine, and if you see the Vicomte again, I will know it, and you will be sorry." The next morning, at the offices of Detective Ledoux, Raoul was there talking to Ledoux, hounding him on what he was doing to find Christine. And then Ledoux says to Raoul, "You must calm down, Vicomte. We are doing everything." And then he says to Raoul, "Please sit down. I have a lot to explain to you." Well, Raoul sits down, and Inspector Ledoux begins to explain to him about what was going on with Christine, and he says to the Vicomte, "Well, your beloved was kidnapped by the infamous Phantom." And then Raoul says, "The Phantom is not real." And then Ledoux says, "He is. He's not a ghost. He's a real flesh and blood man." And then he goes on to explain about the Phantom. And he says to Raoul, "Well, the Phantom's real name is Eric Claudan. He was born in 1852 in Rouen, and he came from a very musical family. He has mastered the violin, the piano, and the organ." And he goes on to further explain about Eric Claudan, saying that in 1866, at 14, he attended the prestigious Paris School of Music, where he graduated in 3 years, and in 1869. That same year, he published his first concerto. Afterwards, in 1870, he fought in the Franco-Prussian War, and after the war was over, he was a professor at the school he graduated from. There he had written an opera and published it called The Maid of Orleans. And before he quit teaching, he had published one more concerto and another musical piece. Afterwards, in 1875, when the Palais Garnier opened up, he became a violinist in the orchestra, and throughout his years there, he alternated playing different instruments. Finally, in 1880, he was made a conductor, and he remained conductor until 1885, when he mysteriously vanished. He was last seen in a brothel near the Rue Morgue. Apparently, he frequented that brothel a lot. And then Ledoux says to Raoul, "Well, Vicomte, I really don't know why he kidnapped Christine, but I have a feeling that she's in great danger." And then Ledoux goes on to further explain to Raoul, "See, the Phantom has been responsible for a spate of murders for 11 years, with the most recent being Joseph Bouquet, the scene shifter at the opera house, and Anatole Garonne, the opera critic, who wrote a very critical piece about Christine." After Ledoux got done explaining everything to Raoul, Raoul had a huge look of worry on his face, and Ledoux assured him that they were going to find Christine and apprehend this killer. Later on, at the boarding house where Christine was staying at, Christine was in her room trying in vain to get the ring off her finger that the Phantom put on, but it was no use. It was not coming off, no matter what she tried. Then she heard the familiar doorbell, and she went out the window to look, as the window to her room overlooked the front door, and to her shock it was Raoul. But she had given instructions earlier to the owner of the boarding house not to let anybody in to see her, including Raoul. Well, the woman who ran the boarding house told Raoul what Christine said, but the woman who ran the boarding house did assure Raoul that she was safe and sound, even though she had a terrible look of fright on her face. Then Raoul left hurriedly. After Christine saw that he left through the window, she quickly sits down and begins to write a note. And then she takes it over where Raoul was staying at and gave it to the butler, and then she left. Well, later Raoul had returned home, and the butler gave him the letter, and Raoul quickly read the letter, and the letter read, "Dear Raoul, I am in danger, and I cannot see you, but if you want to see me tonight, I will be at the opera's masked ball. I will be dressed as a princess. Be careful, he is watching." Later that night, Raoul was there at the masked ball looking for Christine, but he was not alone. He had help. He had told Inspector Ledoux about the situation, and Ledoux was there with his assistant, Daubert, and 2 policemen. They were wearing simple domino masks, while Raoul was dressed like a prince. And Raoul was searching for Christine. He eventually found Christine. She was wearing a blue and white dress. She almost looked Elizabethan. Her blonde hair was tied up in a tight bun, and she had a golden tiara on her head and a domino mask. And Raoul goes up to Christine and says, "Christine, oh, thank God you're safe. Where is this madman who kidnapped you?" And Christine says, "Not now, Raoul, not now. We need to find a safe place to talk." And then she guides Raoul away from the festivities and merriment that was going on in the party. Well, while that was going on, the inspector was walking around, looking around, and he was by the food table, and he noticed a rather haggard-looking man that was collecting a lot of food. This man had on a rat mask and a sash with rats drawn on it. And sensing that he was being watched, the haggard man turns around and says to Ledoux, "What you looking for has already come and gone. It's best for you to leave." Then Ledoux grabs the haggard man by his arm, and he says to him, "Ah, so you work for the Phantom." And the haggard man says, "Oh, I do, and I wish not to betray him." And Ledoux says to the haggard man, "Oh, you're going to betray him, or else you're going to end up in the guillotine." Then suddenly, a mysterious man shows up to the ball. He was walking down the stairs of the lobby. He was clad in red, wearing a wide-brimmed red hat and a skull mask. He also had a staff with a fake snake wrapped around it and a skull on top. Everybody was wondering who he was. And as he made it to the bottom of the stairs, he screams, "Beneath your feet are forgotten dungeons and torture chambers where thousands of men died over the years, and their scream still echoes about. And I, the Red Death, rebuke your merriment." It was definitely the Phantom, and one of the drunken partygoers comes up to him saying, "I must see who you are under that mask, monsieur." And he tries to reach for the skull mask of the Phantom's costume, and the Phantom quickly grabbed his hand and crushed it. The man screamed and ran off in pain, and the phantom walked off somewhere. Meanwhile, on top of the roof of the opera house, Christine had explained everything to Raoul, and Raoul calmed her down and kissed her passionately, and he says to her, "First thing tomorrow morning, we'll be on the first ship out to England." And then Christine kissed him and was just happy. Unbeknownst to both of them, on top of the giant statue on the roof was the Phantom. He had heard the whole thing, and he was angry, and then he snuck off. Back inside the ball, the Phantom violently pushed a reveler out of his way, and he made his way back down to the lower levels. There he had ran into none other than Carlotta Rioli, who was surrounded by men, asking her to dance. Suddenly, the Phantom walks up to her, pulls her towards him, and says, "Of course, mademoiselle, I will dance with you." And they begin to dance, and Carlotta asks the Phantom, "Who are you, monsieur?" And the Phantom says to Carlotta, "I'm a very wealthy benefactor of this opera house." And then Carlotta asks the Phantom, "Then what is your name, monsieur?" And the Phantom says to her, "My name is Eric Claudan, mademoiselle." And then the Phantom whisked her off to a quite secluded part of the opera house, away from the festivities. And Carlotta asked the Phantom, "I must see your face." And the Phantom says to Carlotta, "If you do, mademoiselle, you will die." She lets out a loud giggle, and then she proceeds to pull off the Phantom's skull mask, and before she could let out a scream, the Phantom covered her mouth. Meanwhile, Christine and Raoul had just made it back downstairs. As they were rolling in carts full of food, everybody began to gather around to see what the chef was offering for tonight. He was showing all kinds of delicious meals for the main course, and then he goes over to the cart where the soup was, and he pulls off the lid, and inside was a red soup, and the chef identified it as tomato soup. And then he took a giant ladle and began to stir it, and as soon as he was pulling the ladle out, instead of soup that was coming out, suddenly a severed head had come out of the soup, causing fright to everyone. It was none other than Carlotta's head, and the chef quickly dropped the ladle with the head on it back in the soup. As the panic ensued and everybody was fleeing, Raoul and Christine were separated, and it was during that panic that the Phantom quickly grabbed Christine and whisked away with her. Raoul was screaming for Christine, while Ledoux comes up to Raoul and says, "Don't worry, Raoul, we will find her." And Ledoux pulls towards him the haggard man and says to Raoul, "This is the rat catcher. He knows where the Phantom is at." The rat catcher shows him a secret passageway and leads him down to the labyrinth tunnels beneath the Paris Opera House. And the rat catcher says to the man, "From here on, I must go on my own. If I don't go on ahead and clear the rats, they won't let you pass." And then the rat catcher says to the men, "But also, gentlemen, I must act as the messenger of doom. You go on down here, and the Phantom will kill you all surely. He is not a man. He is a demon from hell." And the rat catcher walks off to clear the rats. Then Inspector Ledoux turns around and tells his assistant Debienne to take the two policemen and head off to the left, and that him and Raoul were going to the right. Then the men split and go different directions. Meanwhile, in the Phantom's lair, the Phantom violently throws Christine onto a table, and then he begins the act of trying to rape her. As he was trying to do that, Christine quickly grabbed his skull mask and pulled it off, and she screamed in horror as she finally saw the Phantom's face. The Phantom's face was disfigured. His skin was leprous yellow. His cheeks were sunken, and the cheekbones very exposed and pronounced. His eyes were sunken and dark around, with the color of his eyes a pale yellowish green, and the eyeballs themselves yellow as his skin. And the Phantom stops the act of what he was trying to do and screams at Christine, "No, no, oh no, you saw my face." Then he turns back around and pins Christine back to the table, and he says to her angrily, "Now feast your eyes and glut your soul on my accursed ugliness." Then the Phantom pulls off his hat, revealing that his hair was thin on top. And he says to Christine, "This is what happens when you sell your soul to the devil." Suddenly, the moment was disturbed by a security bell in the chamber. The Phantom gets from on top of Christine and says to her, "Ah, we have visitors in my world." Then he says to her, "I'll be back," and runs off. Well, the first victim was going to be the rat catcher. As he was clearing away the rats, he was surprised by the Phantom, now completely maskless. And he says to the Phantom, "My God!" And the Phantom says, "You betrayed me!" And the rat catcher says, "No, no, I. And then the Phantom says to the rat catcher, "Silence!" And then the rat catcher says back to the Phantom, "If you kill me, who's going to keep the rats off of you?" And the Phantom says to the rat catcher, "Oh, you'll still be able to do your job." And the Phantom pulls out his dagger and kills the rat catcher. Then he moves on to his next targets, Dobert and the two policemen. Well, Dobert and the two policemen that were with him were definitely lost. And then they hear a voice, "Dobert! Dobert!" The one policeman says to Dobert, "I betches that's the Phantom, monsieur." And sure enough, they saw the Phantom ahead of them, quickly running away. Dobert takes a shot from his revolver and misses. The three men chase after him and they round the corner. There was a dead end, except for on the left there was a door. And the other policeman says, "Dobert, he's probably in there." And then the three men quickly go in there and the door shuts behind them and locks. Dobert pounds on the door and tries to kick it down, but it was no use. And then one of the police officers says to Dobert, "Monsieur, look!" He points out that there were holes on the bottom half of the wall, and there was also holes on the ground. Suddenly, water begins rushing in from the holes in the bottom half of the wall. The room fills up with water, killing the three men. Meanwhile, Raoul and Ledoux make it into the Phantom's lair. There they find Christine crying. Raoul quickly runs up and grabs Christine and holds her tight and comforts her, while Ledoux asks aloud, "Where's this Phantom?" Suddenly, the Phantom appears out of nowhere and stabs Ledoux in the stomach and throws him to the ground. Then he turns around and goes after Raoul. Raoul and Eric fought. As Raoul was holding back the daggered hand of Eric from stabbing him, they were getting dangerously close to one pillar that had a lot of candles that were lit on it. Christine was screaming at him to be careful when suddenly the sash on Raoul's clothing got close to one of the lit candles and caught fire. Suddenly, Raoul was alight. And once he realized he was on fire, it caused his hand that was holding back the Phantom's daggered hand to loosen its grip, and the Phantom was able to stab Raoul in the stomach. And then he pulls out his dagger and stabs Raoul in the heart. Well, Raoul's flaming body falls onto the ground. Christine screamed no, and then the Phantom walks back to Christine, and he says to her, "It's over now, Christine. It's just only me and you." And he grabs both of Christine's hands and lets out a gleeful demonic smile. As he was doing that, unbeknownst to the Phantom, Ledoux was still alive, and Ledoux was struggling to pull out his revolver. Once he was able to get his revolver out, he shoots the Phantom 2 times. When the shots hit the Phantom, it caused the Phantom to fly back, and in the process, his gloved hand slipped off from Christine's hands, and at that moment, he inadvertently pulled off the ring that he gave Christine, freeing her from her soul being wedded to the music. Then Ledoux quickly emptied the rest of his pistol into the Phantom. Now the Phantom was gravely wounded, clutching all the bullet holes that were in him, and he reaches out to Christine, calling her name, and Christine screams at him, "Die, you monster, die!" And she begins to push all the candles from the candelabras and the candle holders, causing a major fire to break out in the Phantom's lair, as all his curtains and drapes that decorated his lair now were on fire. Christine fled out of the Phantom's flaming lair as the Phantom screamed her name, and suddenly the flames engulfed him. It was over. Now Christine was lost in the labyrinth of tunnels. As she was wandering around trying to find her way out, she stumbled upon the body of the rat catcher. The body was almost bones now, as the rats had consumed it, and there were still rats crawling on it. The sight sickened her. She rushed off, but she did not know where she was at, and all hope was starting to get lost when suddenly she was frightened by a figure that emerged from one of the dark tunnels. It was not the phantom, it was the injured Ledoux. He still had the bad stab wound in his stomach, but now he had some burns on him. And he says to Christine, gasping for air, "Thank God, I found you. I know the way out. Follow me." Well, Christine helped the injured Ledoux as he was guiding her out of the dark labyrinth beneath the opera house. And they finally made it out. They were back in the opera house. Well, it was finally over. They were both safe. Ledoux eventually recovered from his injuries and kept on serving as the inspector for the Paris police force for many years. And as for Christine, she went on to become one of the most successful opera singers of the latter half of the 19th and the early half of the 20th century. Like and subscribe. The end.